In 1933, a quarter of all Americans had no job, no paycheck, no safety net, but they survived. Some even thrived. The methods they used have been almost completely erased from memory. Number 14 on this list was so profitable that entire industries were built to destroy it. Number 3 created a black market economy worth more than some states' entire budgets. These 20 forgotten ways of making money required no boss, no office, no resume, just grit and the kind of desperate ingenuity that modern America has trained out of us. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because some of these might actually change how you think about work. Let us count them down. Number 20. Collecting rags and bones. Before the recycling truck existed, there was the rag and bone man. In cities from Boston to Chicago, men and women walked the streets with hand carts or mule-drawn wagons, calling out for old clothes, animal bones, scrap metal, and paper. Textile mills paid cash for cotton and wool rags, which they shredded and then respun into new fabric. Bones went to glue factories and fertilizer plants. A good rag picker in the 1890s in New York could pull in $1 a day, roughly $28 in today's money, enough to feed a family of 4. Immigrant neighborhoods in the Lower East Side ran on this economy. Women sorted rags by fabric type at kitchen tables while children hauled sacks through back alleys. By 1900, an estimated 25,000 people in New York City alone earned their living from waste. The city's sanitation department eventually pushed them out, claiming the streets as public property. But for decades, rag picking was the first rung on the economic ladder for families who had nothing else to stand on. Number 19. Selling apples on street corners. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the International Apple Shippers Association had a surplus problem. Their solution was to sell crates of apples on credit to unemployed men at $1.75 per crate, roughly 60 apples, which could be resold at 5 cents each. Within months, an estimated 6,000 apple sellers lined the sidewalks of New York alone. The image became the defining photograph of the Great Depression. A man in a worn suit, his hat pulled low, standing beside a wooden crate with a hand-lettered sign that read 5 cents. Some sellers earned $2 or $3 a day in good weather, enough for rent in a boarding house and a hot meal. Others stood for hours in freezing rain and sold nothing. Cities tried to ban them, and business owners complained they blocked storefronts. But for a generation of men who had lost everything, that apple crate was the last shred of dignity between them and the breadline. Number 18. Taking in boarders. Before apartments had leases and landlords ran credit checks, ordinary American families opened their spare bedrooms to strangers. By 1900, census records show that roughly 1 in 5 urban households took in at least one boarder. In mill towns across New England, a widow with 3 empty rooms could earn enough from boarders to keep the house. She would cook breakfast and supper, wash linens on Mondays, and collect rent every Friday. A single room in a Pittsburgh boarding house cost between $2 and $4 a week in the 1920s. The arrangement was so common that architects designed homes with separate entrances for boarders. Children grew up sharing dinner tables with steelworkers, traveling salesmen, and school teachers. The practice quietly disappeared after World War II, when suburban mortgages and zoning laws made it illegal in most residential neighborhoods. We regulated away one of the oldest survival strategies in American life. Number 17. Gathering and selling wild ginseng. Deep in the hollows of Appalachia, families dug ginseng root from the forest floor and sold it to buyers who shipped it straight to China. The trade stretches back to the 1700s, when fur traders realized that American ginseng fetched extraordinary prices in Asian markets. By the 1870s, dried ginseng root sold for $3 to $5 a pound at trading posts in West Virginia and Kentucky, a fortune when a coal miner earned $1 a day. Entire families spent September and October in the woods, children spotting the distinctive red berries while parents carefully dug around the roots with hand-forged tools. A single season could earn enough to carry a family through winter. The knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation. Which ridge had the oldest plants? Which north-facing slopes held the biggest roots? Overharvesting and habitat loss have made wild ginseng increasingly rare, but in remote mountain communities, the tradition persists. Diggers still walk the same hollows their great-grandparents walked, searching for the route that connected Appalachian poverty to a market on the other side of the world. Number 16. Selling homemade food door to door. Long before food trucks and Instagram bakeries, women in every American city cooked food in their kitchens and sold it on the street. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Black women in the South baked sweet potato pies, fried chicken and pound cakes, then carried them through neighborhoods on trays balanced on their heads or packed into baskets. In Mexican-American communities across Texas and California, women sold tamales from pushcarts, earning enough to pay rent when their husbands could not find work. A plate of tamales cost 10 cents. A whole pie sold for 25 cents. These women ran businesses without storefronts, licenses, or bank accounts. Their only advertising was the smell drifting down the block and the word of mouth that followed. Health departments eventually cracked down, requiring commercial kitchens and permits that most home cooks could not afford. The cottage food industry that thrives today is really just a return to what American women were doing a century ago, before regulations made feeding your neighbors a crime. Number 15. Harvesting and selling ice. Before electric refrigeration, ice was one of the most valuable commodities in America. Farmers in New England, upstate New York, and the upper Midwest spent winters sawing blocks of ice from frozen lakes and ponds, packing them in sawdust, and storing them in insulated ice houses. A single farmer with a good pond and a strong back could harvest enough ice to earn more than his crops brought in all year. By 1880, the ice trade employed over 90,000 workers and shipped millions of tons as far south as New Orleans, and even to the Caribbean. The pay was backbreaking but reliable. Ice cutters earned between $1 and $2 a day, and the work came during the dead of winter when nothing else could be done. Families depended on that income to bridge the gap between harvest and spring planting. When mechanical refrigeration arrived in the early 1900s, the entire industry collapsed within a generation. Lakes that had supported whole communities went quiet. The ice houses rotted, and one of America's great seasonal economies vanished as if it had melted. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the next few entries were not just forgotten, they were deliberately buried. Number 14. Taking in laundry. For nearly a century, washing other people's clothes was the most reliable source of income available to American women who could not leave the house. In the decades after the Civil War, formerly enslaved women in the South built an entire economy around laundry. In Atlanta, in 1881, washerwomen organized a massive strike, with 3,000 women demanding a uniform rate of $1 per dozen pounds of wash. It was one of the largest labor actions in the post-Reconstruction South. The work was grueling. They hauled water, boiled it over open fires, scrubbed fabric on washboards until their hands cracked and bled, then hung everything to dry and pressed it with heavy, sad irons heated on the stove. A washerwoman in the 1890s might handle 30 to 40 pounds of laundry per customer per week. But she set her own schedule, worked from home, and answered to no foreman. When automatic washing machines became affordable in the 1950s, the profession evaporated. Millions of women lost their primary source of income, and one of the most significant economic contributions of Black women in American history was reduced to a footnote. Number 13. Running a numbers game. In Harlem, on the south side of Chicago, and in Black neighborhoods across urban America, the numbers game was the underground lottery that kept money circulating when legitimate institutions shut their doors. A player picked 3 numbers and placed a bet, sometimes as small as a penny, with a local runner who delivered the slips to a banker. The winning number was drawn from a public source, often the last 3 digits of the day's horse racing totals, to prevent rigging. By the 1930s, The numbers racket in Harlem alone generated $20 million a year. It employed thousands as runners, collectors, and counters. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, ran one of the most successful operations, using her profits to fund community organizations and fight police corruption. The numbers game was illegal, but in communities locked out of banks, credit, and legitimate business opportunities, it served as both economy and social safety net. When state lotteries arrived in the 1960s and the 1970s, they adopted the exact same model, took the profits, and called it progress. Number 12. Selling blood and plasma. During the Great Depression and well into the 1960s, selling blood was one of the quickest ways for a desperate American to put cash in hand. Blood banks paid between $5 and $25 a pint, depending on the city and the blood type. Skid rows in every major city had donor centers within walking distance of flophouses and soup kitchens. The regulars were known by name. Some donated as often as twice a week, leaving them pale and lightheaded, but with enough money for another night's rent. In the 1940s, the Red Cross relied heavily on paid donors to supply blood for the war effort. The practice came under scrutiny in the 1970s, when contaminated blood from paid donors was linked to the spread of hepatitis. Today, selling whole blood is effectively banned in the United States, though plasma donation for compensation remains a multi-billion-dollar industry. The irony is sharp. What was once a survival strategy for the poorest Americans became the foundation of a pharmaceutical supply chain that now generates enormous corporate profits. Number 11. Bootlegging whiskey. Long before Prohibition made it famous, homemade whiskey was currency in rural America. Appalachian farmers discovered early that a bushel of corn worth 50 cents could be distilled into 2 gallons of whiskey worth $4. The math was irresistible. By the late 1700s, whiskey was so widely used as a medium of exchange that when the federal government tried to tax it in 1791, Western Pennsylvania erupted in the Whiskey Rebellion. The tradition never stopped. Through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, families in the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas operated stills as naturally as they planted tobacco. Prohibition just made it more profitable. A gallon of moonshine that cost 60 cents to produce sold for $6 to $8 during the 1920s. Runners modified their cars for speed, outrunning federal agents on mountain roads, a tradition that directly gave birth to NASCAR. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the moonshiners did not stop. Many kept running stills well into the 1960s, not out of rebellion, but because it was the only economy they had ever known. Second pattern break. Now here is something nobody talks about. The next few entries reveal how American ingenuity did not just survive hardship. It created entire underground economies that the government spent decades trying to destroy. Number 10. Trapping and selling furs. For over 2 centuries, the American fur trade was the economic engine of the frontier. But long after the great trading companies faded, individual trappers continued to earn a living from the woods. Through the 1800s and well into the 1900s, men and boys across the rural Midwest and South ran trap lines in the winter months, catching muskrat, raccoon, mink, and beaver. A prime muskrat pelt brought between 50 cents and $1 in the 1930s, and a skilled trapper could take 30 to 50 pelts in a season. Farm boys supplemented their family's income by running trap lines before and after school, selling pelts to traveling fur buyers who drove county roads in battered trucks. The income was seasonal, but significant. In some rural counties, fur money was the difference between keeping the farm and losing it. As suburban sprawl consumed wild habitat and synthetic fabrics replaced fur, the trapping economy quietly collapsed. The last fur buyers disappeared from rural highways in the 1980s, and with them went a way of life that had sustained American families since before the Revolution. Number 9. Shining shoes. In every American city from the 1880s through the 1960s, shoeshine boys and men set up wooden boxes on street corners and outside train stations, offering a buff and polish for a nickel or a dime. The work required almost no capital. A box, a few tins of polish, some rags, and a pair of strong hands. Italian immigrant boys dominated the trade in New York. Black men held the corners in Chicago, Atlanta, and Washington. A good shiner at Grand Central Terminal could earn $5 or $6 a day in tips alone during the 1940s. Solid working-class money. The shoeshine stand was also a listening post, a place where businessmen talked freely and shiners learned the rhythms of money and power. Some used what they heard to start their own businesses. Others simply survived, one pair of shoes at a time. The profession faded as casual dress codes replaced leather dress shoes, and sneakers conquered American feet. Today, a shoeshine stand is a novelty, but for 80 years, it was the entry point into the American economy for men who had nothing else to offer but effort. Number 8. Peddling patent medicines. Before the Food and Drug Administration existed, anyone with a wagon, a recipe, and a good story could travel from town to town, selling cure-all tonics. In the late 1800s, patent medicine sales in the United States exceeded $75 million annually, and a huge share of that went to independent peddlers working county fairs, frontier towns, and rural crossroads. The products were dubious at best. Most were mixtures of alcohol, opium, or cocaine, blended with herbs and marketed as remedies for everything from consumption to baldness. But the salesmanship was extraordinary. Peddlers staged elaborate shows with music, magic tricks, and testimonials from planted audience members. A good medicine showman could clear $50 in a single night at a county fair, an astronomical sum when factory workers earned $10 a week. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 eventually brought regulation, but the traveling peddler survived in diminished form into the 1930s. The modern pharmaceutical industry owes its origin story to these wandering hustlers who proved that Americans would pay anything for the promise of good health. Number 7. Midwifery and healing. Midwives, healers, and community care. In every rural community and immigrant neighborhood, women delivered babies, set broken bones, brewed herbal remedies, and nursed the sick, all for a fee or an exchange of goods. Before hospitals became accessible to ordinary Americans, the local midwife was the entire healthcare system. In the early 1900s, midwives delivered roughly half of all babies born in the United States. In the rural South, granny midwives, most of them black women, charged between $2 and $5 per delivery, when a doctor charged $25. Some were paid in chickens, flour, or labor instead of cash. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, learned from mothers and grandmothers, covering everything from breech births to childhood fevers. The American Medical Association campaigned aggressively to eliminate midwifery in the early 20th century, calling it primitive and dangerous. State after state passed laws requiring medical licensing, effectively criminalizing the women who had kept their communities alive for generations. The current resurgence of midwifery and herbalism is a rediscovery of knowledge that was never lost. It was taken. Number 6. Selling firewood. In the days before natural gas pipelines and electric heating, firewood was a necessity that every household purchased, and cutting and selling it was one of the most accessible ways to earn money in rural America. A man with an axe, a crosscut saw, and a horse-drawn wagon could fell trees on his own woodlot or on public land, buck the logs into stove lengths, and sell cords to town dwellers who had no land of their own. A cord of hardwood in 1910 sold for between $3 and $6 depending on the region, and a strong man could cut and deliver a cord in 2 days. Entire families participated. Fathers felled the trees, sons split the rounds, mothers and daughters stacked the wagon. The income carried rural households through winter when farm work stopped and cash ran dry. As oil furnaces and central heating spread through American homes in the mid-20th century, the demand for firewood plummeted. What had been an essential winter economy became a weekend hobby. But for a century and a half, the woodpile was as important to the American household economy as the paycheck. Third pattern break. Here is where the story gets personal, because the next entries are not just about forgotten economies. They are about the people your own family might have been. Number 5. Fortune-telling and spiritualism. In the decades after the Civil War, a grief-stricken nation turned to spiritualists, mediums, and fortune-tellers in numbers that seem almost unbelievable today. By some estimates, 11 million Americans consulted spiritualists in the 1870s, out of a population of roughly 40 million. Many of the most successful mediums were women, and the income could be substantial. A popular medium in New York or Chicago charged between $1 and $5 per sitting in the 1880s and could see a dozen clients a day. Some traveled the lecture circuit, filling theaters and earning hundreds of dollars per appearance. The Fox sisters, who launched the spiritualist movement in 1848 from a farmhouse in upstate New York, became national celebrities. Fortune-telling was one of the few professions where a woman could earn more than a man. It required no formal education, no physical strength, and no approval from male gatekeepers. Cities eventually passed ordinances against fortune-telling, classifying it alongside vagrancy and prostitution. But the practice never truly disappeared. It simply moved indoors, behind curtained windows and word-of-mouth referrals, where it remains today. Number 4. Collecting and selling scrap metal. During both World Wars, scrap metal became patriotic gold. But long before the government launched collection drives, Americans had been gathering and selling scrap for generations. In the early 1900s, junk dealers in immigrant neighborhoods bought old pots, broken tools, discarded wire, and any piece of metal that could be melted down and reused. A junkyard in 1920s Brooklyn might process 10 tons of scrap in a week, paying collectors by the pound and selling to foundries and steel mills at a markup. Children scoured vacant lots and construction sites. Old men with pushcarts worked the alleys. During the Depression, scrap collecting became a lifeline for the unemployed. When wartime demand sent metal prices soaring in the 1940s, scrap dealers earned more than many factory workers. The industry eventually consolidated into corporate recycling operations, squeezing out the individual collectors who had built it. But for the better part of a century, the American scrap trade was the domain of people with no credentials, no capital, and no options, turning other people's trash into survival. Number 3. Selling homemade liquor during Prohibition. Homegrown liquor and Prohibition profits. When the 18th Amendment banned the sale of alcohol in 1920, it did not stop Americans from drinking. It just redirected the profits. Estimates suggest the illegal liquor trade generated between $3 and $5 billion annually during Prohibition, an astonishing figure in an era when the entire federal budget was under $4 billion, and much of that money flowed not to organized crime bosses, but to ordinary Americans. Housewives brewed beer in their basements, farmers fermented cider in their barns, Italian immigrants made wine in their cellars, which was technically legal for personal use, and then quietly sold the surplus to neighbors. In cities, speakeasies numbered in the tens of thousands. New York alone had an estimated 30,000 by 1927. The bartenders, bouncers, delivery drivers, and lookouts who staffed them were all earning money outside the formal economy. When you outlaw a product that people want, you do not eliminate the market. You just hand the profits to anyone willing to take the risk. Number 2. Keeping backyard chickens and selling eggs. It sounds quaint now, but keeping a flock of laying hens was one of the most reliable income sources for American women from the colonial period straight through the 1950s. The phrase egg money was literal. Women controlled the chicken flock, collected the eggs, and kept the income as their own. In many rural households, egg money paid for groceries, fabric, medicine, and school supplies. By 1900, a hen could lay around 80 to 100 eggs per year, and a dozen eggs sold for 15 to 25 cents at the general store. A flock of 30 hens meant steady weekly income that did not depend on a husband's wages or the weather cooperating with the crops. The economic independence. This gave women was significant and largely unacknowledged. When industrial egg farms scaled up in the 1950s and 1960s, prices collapsed to the point where backyard flocks could not compete. Suburban zoning laws banned chickens from residential areas. One of the oldest and most reliable forms of female economic independence in American history was quietly legislated out of existence. And finally, number 1, taking in piecework and sewing. The most widespread way Americans made money without a traditional job was also the most invisible. For over a century, women across America took in piecework from garment factories, assembling shirts, stitching buttonholes, finishing seams, and rolling cigars at their kitchen tables while minding children and cooking supper. In 1900, an estimated 250,000 women in New York City alone worked in the home-based garment trade, earning between $2 and $6 a week for labor that factory workers earned twice as much to perform. The tenement apartments of the Lower East Side were both homes and workshops. Children as young as 5 pulled basting threads. Grandmothers trimmed loose ends. Entire families worked by gaslight until midnight to meet quotas. The conditions were the subject of some of America's earliest labor investigations. Reformers called it sweated labor and fought to move it into regulated factories. But in doing so, they eliminated the only form of paid work available to millions of women who could not leave their homes. The sewing machine in the parlor, the pile of cut fabric on the kitchen table, the click of scissors after the children went to bed. That was the sound of American women earning money on their own terms, long before anyone called it a side hustle. It was survival, dignity, and independence stitched into every seam. These 20 forgotten ways of making money tell a story that no economics textbook includes. From the rag picker's cart to the washerwoman's tub, from the moonshiner's still to the midwife's hands, Americans found ways to survive that required no employer, no degree, and no permission. The common thread is resourcefulness, turning what you had, your labor, your land, your kitchen, your knowledge, into income when the formal economy had no place for you. Most of these ways were not lost naturally. They were regulated away, industrialized out of existence, or simply forgotten when prosperity made them seem unnecessary. But the instinct that created them is still there. And in a country where millions are rethinking what work means, these forgotten methods might be the most relevant history lesson we have.